There's a very specific kind of tension that only works in dramas like this. The tension of a man sitting behind a steering wheel, pretending his life is small, while the story keeps inching closer and closer to the truth that could blow everything up. Because if you've ever watched a secret identity setup done right, you know it's not actually about the secret. It's about what the secret does to the way someone moves through the world. And Sultan Nyamar Papaku sang Legenda takes that setup, adds a sudden CEO in heels and a tiny kid with big, "I'm watching you" eyes, and then just grabs you by the collar and drags you, literally, into a marriage office like you have no choice but to feel something. And yeah, you're on Flick Flare with me. And if you end up liking the way I break this stuff down, consider subscribing real quick. No pressure. Just, you know how it is. Also, I'm going to keep this mostly spoiler light, more about the premise, the vibes, the craft, the character energy. Because the whole point of a story like this is that delicious wait. How is he going to get out of this feeling? And I'm not here to step on that for you. So the core premise is clean and kind of ridiculous in the best way. By day, he's just a regular taxi driver. A working guy, in the grind, blending into traffic and noise and people who don't look twice. But secretly, he's the sole heir to the ruler of the world. Not rich family. Not big conglomerate. The ruler of the world. Which, honestly, is such an oversized premise that it risks becoming cartoonish. Until the drama anchors it with the most human kind of threat imaginable. A stranger showing up with a child and forcing a decision right now, in public, with witnesses. Suddenly his secret isn't some cool fantasy badge. It's a liability with a ticking clock. And the inciting situation is wild. A beautiful CEO appears in front of him with a little girl and drags him to the KUA to get married on the spot. That's not just a plot twist, that's a tone statement. The show is telling you, immediately, we are not going to gently introduce our chaos. We're going to throw it in your lap and see if you can handle it. And I'm not going to lie, as a viewer, that kind of boldness gets me, even when I'm side-eyeing it. Especially when I'm side-eyeing it. Here's the first thing that clicked for me. The taxi driver cover isn't just about hiding wealth or power, it's about living inside anonymity. There's a particular loneliness to being unseen on purpose, even if you chose it. There's a difference between privacy and erasure, and stories like this love to blur that line. Because I'm safer if no one knows me can turn into I don't know who I am unless I'm alone. And that's where the drama starts having teeth. And then the CEO arrives, and she's not framed like some gentle romantic savior. She's a disruption. She's urgency. She's an adult woman making a decision like she's out of time, like she's been cornered by something bigger than her. And she's choosing the first door that might still open. Which brings me to the first rehook. Because I want you to hold on to this question while you watch. What if she's not dragging him into love? What if she's dragging him into a shield? One of my favorite things about forced proximity setups, when they're handled with any emotional intelligence at all, is how they force characters to show their instincts. You don't get the polished version of someone. You get the reflex, the flinch, the way they lie when they're scared, the way they go quiet when they're calculating. And in a story where the male lead has spent his life controlling his visibility, the worst possible thing is a situation that creates instant paperwork, instant witnesses, instant social reality. A marriage is not just feelings, it's records. It's community acknowledgement. It's a name tied to a name. Let me paint you a mini scene just from the premise as it's given, because you can practically feel how the drama wants this moment to play. It's daytime. The sun is too bright, the kind that makes the road shimmer a little. Inside the taxi, it's that familiar mix of warm plastic, faint old air freshener, a hint of outside dust that sneaks in every time the door opens. He's in that working posture, hands used to the wheel, eyes forward, body trained to be calm because calm gets you through the day. And then the passenger door opens and the world tilts. A woman steps in with a kind of presence that doesn't ask permission. Not loud, but decisive. With her is a small child whose grip on her hand says, "This is my person," and whose gaze says, "I'm smarter than you think." The CEO doesn't do small talk. She does destination. Her voice is clipped, urgent. She says what she wants like it's already been agreed upon. And before he can even process why she knows him, or why she chose him, or how a kid fits into this, she's pulling him out of the taxi and into the noisy, fluorescent, paperwork-scented reality of the KUA, fans humming, chairs scraping, other people glancing up like, "Oh, this is messy." And you can almost hear his secret identity screaming in the back of his head, not because he's guilty, but because he's exposed. That's the emotional engine, not the world ruler air thing, the exposure. Now, I'm going to be honest about something that I think is going to split viewers. The forced marriage element, especially with the dragged to get married immediately framing, can read as romantic fantasy or as deeply uncomfortable depending on how the drama handles consent, pressure, and agency. And since I'm staying spoiler light, I'm not going to pretend I can certify exactly how every beat lands. But what I can say is, the premise is walking a tightrope, and the tightrope is not about morality in the abstract. It's about whether the show understands that urgency doesn't automatically equal romance. Urgency is just urgency. Romance has to be built in the aftermath, in the way the characters respond when the adrenaline wears off. And this is where my slightly contrarian take comes in, because I can already hear the most obvious reading, "Oh, she's a CEO, she's bold, she's the powerful one, she's flipping the usual gender dynamic, so it's automatically fresh." I don't think that's enough. Power doesn't become progressive just because a woman holds it. If she's using it to bulldoze someone else's life, the show needs to look at that honestly. The CEO can be sympathetic, she can be desperate, she can even be right to act fast, but she can't be treated like her choices have no cost. And the most interesting version of this drama is the one that lets her be complicated, protective, and reckless at the same time. Because think about it, she arrives with a little girl. That single detail changes everything. It instantly reframes the CEO's urgency from romantic chaos to maternal crisis, or at least to guardian-level stakes. Even if she's not the child's mother, again, not assuming details, the fact that she's bringing a kid into it means she's either making a protective move or making a dangerous move. Either way, it's not cute. It's serious. A child in a premise like this is the story quietly saying, this isn't just about two adults being dramatic. This will affect someone who didn't choose any of it. And the male lead being an heir to world-level power is such a heightened concept that the show almost has to use it metaphorically if it wants to feel grounded. To me, the heir identity reads like an externalization of pressure, expectations so massive that the only way to breathe is to become invisible. When you're born into something that large, control, legacy, obligation, being a taxi driver isn't just a disguise, it's a rebellion. It's him touching ordinary life with his bare hands. It's him hearing normal people complain about normal problems, paying in cash, forgetting their umbrellas, living lives that don't require security teams and secrecy. And if that's what the taxi life represents, then the CEO crashing into it isn't just romantic disruption. It's fate catching him. It's the world refusing to let him stay small. Here's another thread that hooked me, the title energy. Sultan Nyamar Papaku sang Legenda has that playful, slightly exaggerated vibe. Like it's aware it's telling a larger-than-life story. My dad is a legend type of myth-making. That tells me the show probably wants to balance sincerity with spectacle. And balancing those is hard. If you lean too far into spectacle, the emotions become props. If you lean too far into sincerity, the premise starts to feel silly and the audience checks out. The sweet spot is when the show commits to the feelings as if they're real, even when the situation is absurd. And I think that's why the best scenes in a premise like this aren't the big reveals people usually thirst for. It's the micro moments. Like the way a man who's used to being in control would react when someone else controls the narrative around him. He's not just panicking because his secret might be exposed. He's panicking because his choices are being removed in front of strangers. That's humiliation. That's helplessness. And if the actor playing him understands that, you'll see it in the smallest places. The jaw tightening, the blink that comes a half second too late, the forced politeness that sounds like a wall going up. Every time the show pushes him closer to being known, it's also pushing him closer to having to decide what kind of man he's going to be when he can't hide behind the taximeter anymore. That's character. That's not just plot. Let me rehook you again with something you might not expect to care about. The little girl could end up being the moral compass of the entire drama, not because she gives speeches, but because her presence makes lying harder. Adults can lie to adults all day long. Adults lie professionally. But when a kid is in the room, the lie feels heavier, because now you're not just managing another adult's perception, you're shaping a child's understanding of what's normal. And that's where the drama can get emotionally lethal in a quiet way. Now, from a structure standpoint, the premise is doing that classic double-bind setup. If he refuses the marriage, what happens to the CEO and the child in that moment of urgency? And if he accepts, what happens to his secret identity? It's not just choice A or choice B. It's lose something now or lose something later. Those are the best traps, narratively, because they force ongoing consequences. You can't solve it with one brave decision. You solve it with a series of imperfect choices that reveal who you are. And that's why I'm not even mad at the sheer soapiness of sole heir to the ruler of the world. In the right hands, it's not there to be realistic. It's there to make the emotional stakes feel operatic. It's there so that when he's cornered in a marriage office, it doesn't feel like a random inconvenience. It feels like the universe laughing at him. Like, you thought you could escape destiny by driving a taxi? That's adorable. Visually, dramas like this tend to thrive on contrast, and I hope this one leans into that. The tactile texture of a taxi driver's life, traffic hedge, street noise, sun glare of windshields, the cramped intimacy of a backseat conversation versus the clean, sharp lines you associate with a CEO, glass buildings, polished floors, controlled lighting, the kind of silence that costs money. Even if you don't consciously register it, that contrast is doing storytelling for you. It's telling you these characters come from different climates, different rules, different ways of breathing. And then the KUS setting, even as a concept, is perfect as a collision point because it's bureaucratic. It's not romantic lighting and candles. It's forms, stamps, pens that don't work, waiting, people being called by name. Bureaucracy is the enemy of secrecy. Bureaucracy forces definition. It's hard to be nobody when you're signing legal documents. I also want to talk about the soundscape, because if the show is smart, it uses sound to underline the identity split. A taxi driver's world has constant sonic clutter, engines, horns, chatter, radio fuss. A world-air world is often portrayed with controlled sound, quiet rooms, footsteps echoing, doors closing softly, phone vibrations instead of ringtones. When the CEO drags him into this marriage situation, the sound can become this pressure cooker, the hum of ceiling fans, the scrape of chairs, the muffled voices of other people witnessing your life change. That kind of mundane sound can make a scene feel more intense than a dramatic score because it says, this is real. This is happening in a normal place. And yes, I'm the person who notices when a drama lets silence sit. Silence is where you can hear a character thinking. Silence is where you can feel the actor's choices. If Sultan Nyamar lets its characters sit in discomfort, especially the male lead, who is probably used to controlling every variable, then it's doing something right. Now, let's get into relationship dynamics, because that's where this premise either becomes addictive or becomes exhausting. The CEO and the taxi driver heir are set up in immediate conflict. She's pushing, he's resisting. She's acting like the future is burning. He's acting like the present is a trap. That's friction. And friction can be chemistry. but it can also be abrasion. The difference is whether the show gives them moments of recognition, moments where they see each other as people, not obstacles. And I'm going to say something that might sound weirdly tender for a drama this chaotic. The most romantic thing the show could do isn't a grand gesture. It's letting the male lead be ordinary with her for a second. Letting her see him in his taxi driver rhythm, how he talks to strangers, how he navigates the city, how he holds patience like a skill. And letting him see her not as CEO, but as a woman who is making a terrifying choice. If the show gives you that kind of humanizing exchange early, the forced marriage becomes less of a gimmick and more of a crucible. Because a crucible is not a shortcut. It's pressure that reveals composition. And then there's the secret identity threat, which is basically a built-in suspense machine. The question isn't just, will the secret be exposed? It's what parts of him are already leaking out even when he thinks they aren't? People with power carry themselves differently, even when they try not to. They hesitate differently. They're not used to being dismissed. Or, if they've trained themselves to accept dismissal, they have this controlled humility that can look like confidence. I love when actors play that tension. The body language of someone performing normalcy while their instincts keep betraying them. Here's my personal confession moment. And I'm not saying this to get sentimental on you. I'm saying it because it genuinely affects how I watch stories like this. I have a soft spot for characters who choose invisibility because they don't trust what happens when they're seen. That's not just a plot device to me. It's a real fear. The fear that if people know the full truth about you, your background, your obligations, your real identity, they won't love you. They'll just manage you. They'll want something. They'll treat you like a resource. So the taxi driver cover, for me, isn't just cool. It's protective. And when the CEO threatens to blow that up in public, it hits a nerve. And then I laugh at myself a little because I'm sitting here psychoanalyzing a drama where someone is literally the heir to the ruler of the world. Like, okay, calm down, it's not that deep, except it kind of is, if the show wants it to be. That's the fun of these stories. They're ridiculous and relatable at the same time, and you feel slightly embarrassed that your heart is getting involved. And then you keep watching anyway. Let me pull you back in with another tension point. The child. The child is not just cute accessory here. The child is leverage. Emotional leverage, moral leverage, narrative leverage. Because the minute a child is involved, the male-led's choices are no longer just about his own safety. He can't just do the selfish smart thing and disappear. If he's a decent person, and the premise kind of requires him to be, he's going to feel pulled into responsibility. And that is such a clever way to trap a character who has built his entire life around controlled distance. And if the CEO is bringing the child as part of her urgency, then the show is also quietly asking you to judge her. Is she using the child as a bargaining chip? Or is she genuinely trying to secure a stable situation for the child? Or is she doing that messy human thing where both are true at once? I'm telling you, the most interesting version of the CEO is not Ice Queen with a heart. It's competent woman making desperate moves that may not be clean. This is where I want the writing to surprise me. Because the easy route is to make the male lead purely noble and the CEO purely misunderstood. The richer route is to make them both right and wrong in different ways. To make him complicit in his own isolation. To make her complicit in her own bulldozing. To make their eventual bond, if it forms, feel earned through confrontation, not destiny. The premise also opens a thematic lane about institutions. The KUA isn't just a setting. It symbolizes how society formalizes relationships, how it turns emotion into status, how it makes private life public. A secret at trying to stay anonymous is basically trying to opt out of institutional control. A CEO dragging him into legal marriages, intentionally or not, using institution as a weapon. That's spicy. That's not just romance. That's power meeting paperwork. And speaking of power, I really need to stress, CEO in dramas is often shorthand for competence, wealth, and social authority. But being a CEO doesn't automatically mean you're emotionally intelligent. Sometimes it means you're used to getting compliance. So if the CEO's first move is to drag someone into marriage, I'm not reading that as bold romantic lead. I'm reading that as a person who is used to solving problems by forcing outcomes. And again, that can be sympathetic if the show frames it as survival. But it has to be examined. Because if the show doesn't examine it, then the whole romance risks being built on imbalance. Now, let's talk momentum, because this premise is designed to be propulsive. You start with ordinary life. Then you hit the inciting chaos. Then the secret identity threat hooks you into sustained tension. That's a clean runway. The danger is that some dramas confuse momentum with noise. They keep escalating external events without deepening the internal stakes. What I want from Sultan Nyamar is not just more problems. I want sharper problems. Problems that force specific emotional decisions. For example, how does the male lead manage his daily taxi driver persona once he's tied, legally or socially, to a CEO and a child? How does he handle the whiplash of switching masks too quickly? Even if the show keeps the plot details light, that psychological friction is where the performance can shine. The best secret identity stories don't treat the secret as a cool twist. They treat it as stress, like carrying a glass of water through a crowd without spilling. Eventually, your hand shakes. I also want to highlight how the premise sets up an audience pleasure that's a little guilty. We enjoy watching powerful people be forced into ordinary discomfort. The heir to world power, having to deal with mundane bureaucracy, awkward social interactions, being judged by strangers, that's delicious. But here's the ethical twist the drama can lean into. He's not just powerful. He's choosing to be ordinary. That choice matters. It suggests he's trying to be human before he's forced to be a symbol. And the CEO? The CEO is likely used to being the one who controls the room. So when she steps into the taxi driver's world, streets, crowds, unpredictability, she's out of her element, even if she doesn't admit it. If the show lets her be rattled, even briefly, it will make her feel more real. CEOs in dramas often get written like superheroes. I want her written like a person with a title, not a title with a person. Here's another rehook, because it's the kind of thought that keeps me watching. What if the real secret isn't that he's the heir? What if the real secret is why she picked him? That question is doing so much work, because the premise doesn't say she met him randomly. It says she suddenly appears in front of him with a child and drags him to marry right then. That feels targeted. That feels like she knows something. And the moment you get the sense that this isn't random, the drama becomes a chess game. Not just romantic chaos, a strategic collision. And you know what's fun? The show can play that in multiple emotional keys. It can be suspenseful. Is she a threat? It can be tender. Is she seeking safety? It can be manipulative. Is she using him? It can be tragic. Is she out of options? The best dramas let you cycle through all those interpretations before landing somewhere. Now, since I'm staying spoiler light, I'm not going to claim how the show resolves that. But as a reviewer, I can tell you, the premise gives the writers a buffet of tension types. Identity tension, class tension, relationship tension, parenthood tension, institutional tension. The question is whether they pick one or two to truly dip in, or whether they try to eat everything and end up with a mess. Let's talk about acting choices in this kind of story, because it's deceptively hard. The male lead has to perform ordinary in a way that doesn't become bland. He can't just be quiet and nice. He has to have a specific texture. A taxi driver has habits. The way he checks mirrors, the way he watches people without staring, the way he keeps his voice even when someone is rude. If the actor nails those micro behaviors, you believe the disguise. And then, when the heir identity gets pressured, you need tiny fissures, moments where a different kind of confidence leaks through, not in a macho way, but in a "I'm used to rooms where people don't say no" way. The CEO, meanwhile, has to avoid becoming a trope machine. If she plays everything at a 10, cold, bossy, unshakable. Then the forced marriage move just makes her look like a villain. But if she layers it with strain, with speed, with the subtle tremor of someone who's making a huge decision while pretending it's nothing, then suddenly she becomes fascinating. The best versions of this character are the ones where you can see the fear underneath the efficiency. And the child actor, if the show gives the kid space to be a kid rather than a plot device, can elevate everything. Kids don't act like adults. They don't deliver perfect lines like little sages unless the writing is forcing it. The most emotionally effective child presence is usually in reactions. The way they watch adults carefully, the way they sense tension, the way they cling tighter when voices sharpen. If Sultan Nyamar understands that, the kid becomes the audience's heartbeat. I want to circle back to the word legend in the title because it suggests myth. It suggests the story wants to build a larger-than-life aura around the father figure or the lineage. And if the male lead is the heir to a world ruler, then fatherhood, literal or symbolic, might be a huge thematic undercurrent. Even without inventing plot, you can feel the shape of it. What does it mean to inherit a throne you didn't ask for? What does it mean to be someone's legend when you're just trying to be a person? That's where the Papaku part lands for me. It hints at generational weight. And generational weight is always interesting when you put it next to a child. Because the male lead is potentially caught between being someone's son and being someone's father figure, whether he wants that or not. And the CEO, dragging him into marriage with a child in tow, is basically forcing him into a role prematurely. Role pressure is drama fuel. Because roles don't care about your readiness. There's also something deliciously messy about the gender dynamics here that I hope the drama leans into thoughtfully. A male-led who is secretly the most powerful heir imaginable, choosing a humble job. A female-led who is publicly powerful, privately urgent. That can become a story about masks, how men hide vulnerability behind humility, how women hide vulnerability behind authority. And when those masks collide, you get friction that can either become intimacy or war. And I'm going to be very real. I'm tired of dramas that treat powerful women as a costume that gets stripped off once the romance starts. If the CEO is competent, let her stay competent. Let her still be sharp after she falls in love, if love happens. Let her still make strategic decisions. The romance should not be her becoming softer in a way that makes her smaller. Softness can be strength, but only if it's chosen, not imposed. At the same time, I don't want the male-led's humility to be treated like a gimmick that disappears once his secret is revealed. If he values ordinary life, that value should matter later. Otherwise, the taxi driver cover is just a plot trick. The show has the opportunity to say something kind of radical, even inside a ridiculous premise, that power doesn't have to erase humanity, and that choosing humility isn't weakness, it's clarity. Okay, another rehook. Because this is where I think the drama could either soar or stumble. The marriage office moment isn't just a shocking start. It's a thesis. It's the show asking, what happens when a life-changing commitment is made under pressure? And if the show keeps coming back to that question, what commitment means, what consent means, what responsibility means, then it can hit way harder than you'd expect from the setup. Now, a quick note on pacing and tone, because this premise can flip between melodrama and comedy very easily. A taxi driver being dragged into instant marriage is inherently absurd. The show can mine that for humor, awkwardness, misunderstandings, the sheer speed of it all. But humor has to come from character truth, not from making the situation feel trivial. The funniest moments in these stories are usually when characters try to act normal in an abnormal situation. Like someone asking a mundane question, "Do you have a pen?" while their entire future is being rewritten. If Sultan Nyamar gets that right, the comedy becomes a release valve rather than a distraction. It lets you breathe so the tension can tighten again. And I do think the premise has room for real tenderness. Not big sweeping romance right away. Again, forced marriage means you have to be careful. but tenderness in the way strangers become familiar, in the way routine forms when you don't have time to plan, in the way a child can soften the air in a room simply by existing, by needing something simple like food or rest while adults are spiraling. Those grounding needs can force adults to stop posturing. That's often where chemistry actually forms, in the mundane. In "Are you hungry?" In "Did you sleep?" In "She's scared." In "Don't raise your voice around her." If the show gives you those moments, the premise starts to feel less like a gimmick and more like an emotional situation. I also want to talk about the identity threatened to be exposed line because it implies a long game. It implies near misses, pressure, and the constant fear of being recognized. And for a viewer, that's addictive because every scene becomes a potential landmine. A casual conversation could go wrong. A document could reveal too much. A photo could be taken. A stray comment could trigger suspicion. The show doesn't even need huge action to maintain suspense. It just needs consistent vulnerability. And that's something I really appreciate when dramas do it well. Suspense without constant explosions. Suspense built from social proximity, from bureaucracy, from relationships tightening around a character like a net. Here's a subtle thing I hope the drama pays attention to. The male lead's internal justification for staying hidden. Characters like this often tell themselves they're protecting others. If people know who I am, they'll get hurt. That can be true, but it can also be a convenient excuse to avoid intimacy, to avoid being accountable, to avoid being challenged. If the show has the courage to interrogate that, again, without needing some huge twist, then the character arc becomes richer. And the CEO can serve as a mirror. Because CEOs are often written as people who have had to be accountable in a very public way. Results, reputation, responsibility. If she's dragging him into marriage, she's forcing him into accountability in a way he hasn't practiced. Even if her methods are questionable, the dynamic can be narratively potent. She's pulling him into the world of consequences. Now, I can already hear some viewers saying, this is just a power fantasy. And sure, on one level, it absolutely is. Secret air, hidden power, inevitable reveal, those are classic fantasy ingredients. But I think it's too easy to dismiss that as shallow. Power fantasies often exist because people are exhausted. People want to imagine that the invisible person in the crowd is actually important. That the person doing ordinary work has secret value that will eventually be recognized. That's not just childish. It's a response to feeling unseen in real life. And that's why I get protective of stories like this when they're done with sincerity. Because if the show treats the taxi driver life with respect, it's not insulting ordinary work, it's honoring it. It's saying, even if you're secretly destined for something huge, your humanity is formed in the small moments. And yes, there's a part of me that rolls my eyes at Ruler of the World because it's so maximalist. But another part of me respects the audacity. Like, okay, you're not going to pretend this is subtle. You're going to go all the way. Fine. If you go all the way, then you better earn the emotions. Let me get self-aware for a second. Just a quick aside. Because I know how I sound when I say earn the emotions about a drama with this kind of title. I'm the kind of person who will complain about a plot being unrealistic and then cry because a character quietly handed someone a glass of water. So take me as I am. I want spectacle, but I want it anchored. I want chaos, but I want it to mean something. And the CEO arriving with the child is already a strong anchor because it drags the premise out of pure fantasy and into a kind of social reality. A child is not fantasy. A child is responsibility. Another rehook for you. The most intense conflict in this drama might not be, will the secret be exposed, but what kind of family is being built under pressure? And is it fair to the child? That's the question that would keep me up if I were inside the story. Because adults can choose mess. Kids get dragged through it. Now, since I'm reviewing in a spoiler-light way, I'm going to focus on what the premise suggests about the show's thematic intentions. The drama is setting up a triangle of identities. There's the man as worker. There's the man as heir. And there's the man as potential husband-father figure, whether he wants that label or not. Those identities can't all coexist peacefully. Something has to give. And the show can create incredible tension by making him choose, again and again, which identity gets to speak in a given moment. For example, does he respond to the CEO with deference, like a driver to a passenger? Or with resistance, like a man being controlled? Does he respond to the child with warmth, like a natural caregiver? Or with distance, like someone afraid to bond? Those choices create emotional continuity. They show you who he is beyond the premise. The CEO has her own identity triangle too. There's the CEO as public figure. There's the woman as private person in crisis. And there's the caregiver role tied to the child. And those will conflict. A CEO is used to optimizing. A caregiver is used to soothing. A person in crisis is used to surviving. Watching her switch between those modes, if the performance is nuanced, can be genuinely compelling. And the reason I keep emphasizing performance nuance is because premises like this can easily become archetypes. The hidden king, the ice queen, the mysterious child. Archetypes can be fun, but they're not enough for long-form emotional investment. You need the moment where an archetype cracks and a person shows through. Even the way the show frames the taxi can matter. Is it shot like a cramped little box, making him look trapped? Or is it shot like a cockpit, making him look in control? That's not just aesthetic. That's meaning. A taxi can be freedom. He moves through the city. He chooses routes. He is in motion. Or it can be limitation. He's stuck in traffic. He's literally transporting other people's lives while his own is paused. A good director uses that symbolism without needing to spell it out. And the KUA moment, again, could be filmed like a bureaucratic nightmare, close-ups on stamps, papers, fingers tightening around a pen, the slight wobble of someone's breath as they realize this is real. Or it could be filmed like comedy. Or it could be filmed like a thriller, with the sense that every person in the room might be a witness who shouldn't exist. If the show chooses the thriller tone there, it makes the secret identity feel fragile. If it chooses comedy, it makes the romance feel central. If it chooses realism, it makes the consent and pressure feel heavier. Tone is ethics, sometimes. I'm also interested in how the show handles the world ruler concept without making it too abstract. Because ruler of the world could mean literal governance, or it could mean a shadowy empire, or it could just be a heightened way of saying ultimate power. The premise doesn't specify, so I'm not going to pretend it does. But whichever direction the show goes, what matters is how that power threatens the characters emotionally. Power should complicate love, not just decorate it. Power should make trust harder. It should make safety ambiguous. Because if he's that powerful, secretly, then the CEO dragging him into marriage isn't just a woman forcing a man into a relationship. It could become a political move, even if she doesn't intend it that way. Marriage to power changes your life. It changes what people want from you. It changes what danger can reach you. And that's where the story's tension becomes almost claustrophobic in a good way. Because the romance, if it becomes romance, would be happening inside a cage of implications. The kind of relationship where you can't just ask, "Do you like me?" You have to ask, "What does liking me cost you?" I want to sit with that for a second, because it's actually the reason I think this premise has more potential than it might look like at first glance. A lot of dramas chase romance like it's the only goal, but romance under pressure reveals character faster than romance under comfort. When you don't have time to curate yourself, what you choose to do is who you are. The CEO choosing to force marriage says something about her. The male-led's response, whether he fights, freezes, negotiates, protects the child, tries to disappear, says something about him. And those say something moments are what make a show bingeable. Another small thing, the drama can use the taxi as a confessional space. Cars are intimate. You're close, but you're facing forward, which makes it easier to talk. The city passes by like moving wallpaper. People confess in cars because it feels like the words can escape out the window. If the show is smart, it will use that. It will let the characters say things in transit they can't say face to face. And if the CEO is used to boardrooms and controlled conversations, being in a taxi could force her to talk differently. Less polished, more immediate. That shift can be subtle, but it's powerful. Now let's talk about the secret identity threatened to be revealed aspect again. Because it's not just an external threat, it's an internal temptation. Sometimes characters with huge hidden identities want to be found. Not consciously, but emotionally. They want someone to see them and not run. They want to stop performing. So part of the tension could be him actively hiding, while another part of him is exhausted and curious about what happens if he doesn't. That's the kind of contradiction that makes a character feel alive. And that's what I mean when I say the drama needs to earn the emotions. It needs to let characters be inconsistent in human ways, not inconsistent in sloppy writing ways. Here's a rehook that's more of a dare. If the show can make you sympathize with both the man whose life is being hijacked and the woman who is doing the hijacking, then it's doing something genuinely tricky. Because most viewers will pick a side instinctively. Some people will be like, he's being trapped, that's wrong. Others will be like, she's desperate, she has a child, she needs help. The best dramas make you feel both discomfort and empathy, sometimes in the same scene. They make you feel your own judgment shifting. And when that happens, you're not just watching plot. You're engaging with moral tension. And moral tension is sticky. It keeps you thinking after the episode ends. I'm also curious how the show positions marriage as a concept. Is it a sacred institution? A legal tool? A social performance? A refuge? A trap? The premise suggests it can be all of these at once. The CEO dragging him to the KUA implies marriage as a tool, something you do to change your status instantly. But if the show wants emotional payoff later, it has to also treat marriage as something that affects the soul, not just the paperwork. And again, I'm not claiming what happens. I'm saying the setup gives the writers a chance to explore that contradiction, to show a marriage that begins as strategy and gradually becomes relationship, or to show how strategy can poison relationship, or to show how two people can renegotiate a bond that started unfairly. The child complicates it further, because marriage in the presence of a child is never just to adults. It's household, it's routines, it's who picks up from school, who cooks, who comforts nightmares. Even if the show doesn't go deep into domestic detail, the implication is there, and it gives the story weight. I want to zoom out to what this drama is, genre-wise, based on the premise alone. It's romance, obviously, but it's also identity thriller. It's also social satire potential, CEO world versus taxi world. And it's also family drama potential because of the legend, lineage, and the child. Those genres don't always play nicely together. But when they do, you get that addictive feeling of I'm here for the romance. But why am I suddenly invested in the family tension and the identity suspense too? That's the dream. And I think that's why the premise is smart to start with a jolt. Starting with the forced marriage move means the show doesn't have to beg for your attention. It's already in the mess. Now it just has to dip in it. One more personal reaction, grounded and real. Stories about people hiding who they are always make me think about how much energy it takes to maintain a lie, even a lie you think is protective. The constant monitoring of your own words, the constant fear of being caught, the constant adjustment to other people's expectations. That kind of life makes you tired. And tired people make mistakes. Tired people also reach for comfort in ways they can't explain. So when the CEO and child enter his life, I'm not just watching for plot tension. I'm watching for exhaustion. For the moment he slips. For the moment he chooses honesty because he can't keep carrying the disguise. And if the show can portray that exhaustion without melodrama, just with quiet, accumulating strain, it'll feel painfully real. At the same time, I need the show to respect the fact that being dragged into marriage is not a cute inconvenience. It's a serious violation if it's framed that way. So my hope, based on premise alone, is that the drama uses that shock to set up conflict and accountability, not to romanticize coercion. If it does the latter, it'll lose me. If it does the former, if it treats the act as messy, fraught, desperate, and then forces the characters to deal with the consequences, then we're in business. Because consequences are where drama becomes story. And there's also this delicious irony baked in. The one man in the world who supposedly has the most power is the one getting dragged around like he has none. That irony can be played for humor, sure, but it can also be played for commentary. Power on paper doesn't always translate to power in a moment. Emotional leverage, social pressure, a child's presence, those can overpower wealth and status in a heartbeat. If the show understands that, it can make the heir feel less like a superhero and more like a person who's learning that control is not the same as strength. I keep thinking about how the CEO enters the story, suddenly appears. That phrasing is important. It makes her feel like an event, not a character strolling in. And events usually come with aftershocks. Even if the male lead manages to keep his secret intact for a while, the CEO's presence changes his daily life forever. Once someone has seen you in a vulnerable moment, you can't go back to being invisible in the same way. Even if they never speak again, the knowledge exists. But in this story, she doesn't just see him. She binds him. That's the escalation. And that's why I think the drama's emotional core is going to be about control. Who gets to define your life? Who gets to claim you? Who gets to name you? The heir has been defining himself as ordinary. The CEO is forcing a new definition. Husband. The world ruler lineage will likely force another definition. Successor. And the child might force yet another. Father. Those labels are heavy. They can be comforting or suffocating depending on whether you chose them. So when I watch a premise like this, I'm not just watching to see if the secret gets revealed. I'm watching to see which label the male-led fights hardest against. Because that tells you what he fears most. Not exposure. Necessarily. Sometimes people fear obligation more than exposure. Sometimes they fear becoming what they were born to be. And I'll stop right here on this thought because it's the hinge I keep coming back to. If Sultan Nyamar is at its best, the real drama won't be whether his secret identity is discovered. It'll be whether he can choose a life that feels like his before the world chooses it for him. And what I find genuinely intriguing is how the premise forces you to question what his even means in the first place. His name, his job, his privacy, his future. When you're living as a cover identity, you're already renting pieces of yourself out to the day-to-day just to survive. Then the CEO shows up and basically says, actually, I'm taking a lease out on your whole life. And that's not romantic by default. That's terrifying. But it's also a very honest launching point for a story about intimacy. Because intimacy can feel terrifying when you've built your whole sense of safety around being unclaimed. If you're the type of viewer who likes neat moral lines, this drama's premise is going to poke you on purpose. Because the show doesn't open with mutual flirting. It opens with urgency and pressure. And it dares you to stay long enough to see whether that pressure gets interrogated, softened, punished, forgiven, redirected, transformed, whatever the writers decide to do. It's basically saying you're going to have feelings before you've made up your mind. And that's an uncomfortable place to be as an audience. But it's also the place where drama actually happens. There's also a very modern texture to this setup that I don't think people talk about enough. Paperwork as destiny. We live in a world where your life can change because a form exists. A database entry exists. A legal status exists. So when the CEO drags him into an official marriage setting, it's not just a personal move, it's a systems move. The system becomes the third character in the room. And systems don't care if you're scared. Systems don't care if you're hiding. Systems just process. Here's the thing that makes secret heir living as a taxi driver emotionally juicy rather than just silly. A taxi is a mobile boundary. It's a private space that moves through public space. You're inside, but you're exposed. You can lock the doors, but everyone can still see you through the windows. That's basically what his life is. Private truth moving through public life. And the CEO forcing marriage is like someone grabbing the steering wheel. And I know that sounds dramatic, but that's the point. This premise is a pressure test, not just for him, but for what the show believes about love. Because some dramas believe love is fate. Some believe love is choice. Some believe love is a refuge. This one, from the premise alone, is flirting with a darker idea. Love as collateral. Love as cover. Love as protection. Love as bargain. The question is whether it stays in that cynical lane or whether it turns that lane into a bridge. Let me drop a rehook that I think is going to color everything. If the male-led's secret identity is threatened to be exposed, who benefits from that exposure? That's the kind of question that turns a romance premise into something closer to a chessboard. Because exposure isn't a weather event. It's usually an action. Someone leaks something. Someone corners someone. Someone recognizes someone. And when you're dealing with a world ruler-heir concept, exposure has implications beyond embarrassment. It has implication energy, which means the characters might not just be fighting feelings, they might be fighting incentives. Now, staying spoiler-light means I'm not going to pretend I know how the show handles that. But I can talk about the kinds of storytelling moves that would make this premise sing. The first is restraint. Weirdly, restraint. Because when you have a big premise, the temptation is to constantly prove it. Prove the heir status, prove the CEO status, prove the stakes, prove the danger. But the most effective way to build tension is often to let the ordinary scenes do the work. Let the taxi rides carry subtext. Let the CEO's posture in a simple room look out of place. Let the child's reactions tell you what adults are refusing to say. If you want a show like this to feel addictive rather than exhausting, you have to create a rhythm of escalation and intimacy. Escalation alone is just noise. Intimacy alone is just slow. You need that pulse. Chaos hits, then a quiet moment forces them to deal with it. Then chaos hits again, but now the quiet moment has changed them, so the chaos lands differently. And because the premise starts with such an extreme act, instant marriage pressure, the drama has to find new ways to escalate that don't feel repetitive. It can't just keep dragging him to new offices, new confrontations, new public scenes. It has to escalate internally. It has to escalate in what each character is willing to admit, what each character is willing to sacrifice, what each character is willing to risk. That's the only escalation that stays fresh after the shock wears off. I keep coming back to the CEO because her introduction is a provocation. In dramas, CEOs are often presented as cool, efficient, and a little emotionally remote. But this CEO is doing something impulsive, messy, and socially explosive. That contradiction is either going to be her depth or her inconsistency, depending on how the writing supports it. If the show gives her an emotional logic, desperation, timing, danger, a narrowing corridor, then she becomes a character. If it just uses her for wow factor, she becomes a device. And I'm going to say it plainly. I hope the drama doesn't rush to justify her in a simplistic way. Because the strongest version of her is not secretly an angel who had no choice. The strongest version is a person who made a harsh choice and now has to live with it. That's where accountability lies. That's where the story can mature. There is a subtle difference between empathy and absolution. Good dramas let you feel empathy without forcing absolution. They let you understand why someone did something without telling you it was fine. If Sultan Nyamar understands that difference, it can handle this premise without feeling morally slippery. Now, the child. This is where a lot of dramas either level up or fall apart. When a child is introduced, writers sometimes treat them like a cuteness generator or a plot trigger. But a child is actually a mood. A child changes how adults speak. A child changes what adults reveal. Adults perform better around children. Or they break down faster because they feel watched. So if the show uses the child as an emotional lens instead of a prop, it's going to hit harder. And there's also something quietly brutal about the child being present in a forced marriage scenario. It makes the adult mess feel inherited, like you're watching someone's future therapy bills being written in real time. That might sound harsh, but it's the truth of why kids add weight to plots. They make the consequences visible. Here's a rehook that's almost a warning. If the show tries to make the child wise beyond her years just to move the adults along, it'll cheapen the whole thing. If the child is allowed to be confused, needy, clingy, suspicious, playful, quiet, real, then every adult decision will feel heavier. Now, about the male-led's secret identity. Sole heir to the ruler of the world is such a massive statement that it risks flattening him into an archetype, the hidden king. But the taxi driver layer is an opportunity to make him tactile, to make him specific. If the show invests in his ordinary habits, his work ethic, his way of interacting with strangers, then the heir becomes a shadow behind a real person instead of a costume on top of a blank slate. And one of the best tricks in secret identity storytelling is using competence as an accidental tell. Because someone with high-level training, high-level protection, high-level upbringing tends to be good at certain things in ways that don't match their cover. Maybe it's the way he stays calm under pressure. Maybe it's the way he reads rooms. Maybe it's the way he refuses to be intimidated by titles. If the show sprinkles that in gently, without making him superhuman, it creates that delicious something is off tension without having to reveal anything outright. Also, can we talk about how emotionally complicated it is to be the sole heir to something? Sole means no siblings to share the burden, no one who truly gets it. It's isolation baked into a title. You can be surrounded by staff and still be alone in the one role that defines you. So if this man chose to be a taxi driver, part of me reads it as him trying to escape not just power, but loneliness. Trying to exist in a world where people complain to him about the weather and the price of lunch instead of looking at him like a monument. And now the CEO and child are threatening to turn him into a monument again. A husband on paper, a father figure in practice, a man with a public tie. Here's where I get personally invested, and I'm admitting it because it shapes my taste. I love stories where someone who's been living in self-protective isolation is forced into connection, but I only love them when the story respects the pain of that shift. Because connection isn't automatically healing. Sometimes it's triggering. Sometimes it feels like being cornered. Sometimes it makes you lash out. So if the male lead reacts badly at times, if he's defensive, if he's cold, if he's stubborn, that doesn't make him unlikable to me. It makes him plausible. What matters is whether the show understands why he's reacting that way, and whether it lets him grow without turning him into a saint. Rehook. The moment the male lead starts caring about the child is the moment the entire power dynamic of the premise changes, and you can feel the story tightening its grip. Because once he cares, he can be controlled. That's the dark truth. Caring is leverage. And the CEO bringing a child into the situation might mean she's seeking safety, but it might also mean she's intentionally or unintentionally creating a lever. Not because she's evil, but because humans under pressure use what they have. And if you're watching this like a drama critic, that's the spine you want to track. Who has leverage, when and how it shifts. Now, I want to pivot to craft in a way that still feels human, because a show like this lives or dies in editing. If the editing is too frantic, the emotional beats won't land. If it's too slow, the premise starts to feel unbelievable because no one in that situation would move that calmly. The ideal edit would have snap during the public pressure moments, shorter cuts, tighter framing, heightened sound, then longer takes during private fallout, where the actors can actually breathe and you can read their faces. A forced marriage setup also benefits from reaction shots. Not the cheesy kind, the kind that shows you a flicker of doubt, a moment of calculation, a flash of fear. Reaction shots are how you keep a character human while they're doing something extreme. If the CEO is dragging him forward, I want to see the exact moment her eyes shift. Like she's thinking, I hate that I'm doing this, but I'm doing it anyway. That's the stuff that makes a character three-dimensional. Cinematography-wise, The Taxi can be shot in such a psychologically rich way. If you shoot from the dashboard, you trap the character behind glass. If you shoot from the backseat, you put the viewer in the position of a passenger, someone being carried along. If you shoot through the side mirror, you emphasize identity distortion, faces warped by reflection. Mirrors in car scenes are always symbolic, whether the director admits it or not. Mirrors are literally about seeing a version of reality that's slightly off. And if the show is visually smart, it'll use reflections to hint at the double life. Not in a cheesy way like, Huff's face is in shadow. More like, he's seen in fragments. He's seen through glass. He's always slightly separated from the world, until the CEO and child crash through that separation. There's also a chance for the show to use wardrobe as storytelling without shouting. Taxi driver clothes tend to be functional. CEO clothes tend to be curated. If those visuals start to mix, if she's forced into more casual environments, if he's forced into more formal environments, that can become a quiet metaphor for how their lives bleed into each other. Now, I want to talk about the emotional realism of marrying right now, because even when a drama makes it happen, the aftermath should feel surreal. That's what I'd want to see. Not just the act, but the disorientation after. The wait, is this real? Feeling. The feeling of walking outside, and the world looking the same even though your life just changed. The CEO and the taxi driver stepping back into daylight and hearing traffic like nothing happened. That contrast, internal earthquake, external normalcy, is one of the most powerful feelings a drama can capture. And that's where music matters. If the score tries too hard to tell you what to feel, big romantic swells, melodramatic strings, it can cheapen the surreal shock. But if the music is restrained, or if it uses a simple motif that feels more like a pulse than a speech, it can heighten the unreality. Sometimes the best scoring choice is to let ambient sound dominate, and bring music in only when the characters finally feel something they can't suppress. Rehook. The best version of this story doesn't make the forced marriage feel exciting. It makes it feel consequential. Because excitement is easy. Consequence is storytelling. Now let's get into something that's easy to overlook. The social context of a taxi driver. Taxi drivers see people at their most unguarded. People fight in taxis, cry in taxis, confess in taxis, flirt in taxis, sit in silence in taxis when they don't know what else to do. So the male lead has likely been absorbing humanity from the front seat for a long time. He's been watching how people behave when they think they're not being judged. That's actually a brilliant hidden skill for someone who might one day rule or inherit power. Empathy by observation. Not necessarily empathy in the warm, gentle sense, but in the I know how people work sense. If the show leans into that, his taxi life becomes training for navigating the CEO's world and the world ruler legacy. Not in a he's amazing at everything way, but in a he understands people way. And the CEO, being a CEO, may be surrounded by people who perform for her, people who flatter, people who hide bad news, people who don't say the truth because they want something. So imagine the tension when she's stuck with a man who has spent years listening to strangers who don't want anything from him except a ride. That contrast could create a fascinating intimacy. He's one of the few people around her who might speak plainly because he's not trying to climb her ladder. And she's one of the few people around him who can bulldoze through his invisibility, for better or worse. There's also meta pleasure in these stories. Watching social status flip in private. In public, a CEO is powerful. In a taxi, she's just a passenger. In a marriage office, she's just another person with paperwork. Those situations can strip away the performance and force her into a more human state. Meanwhile, the taxi driver is ordinary in public. but in private he may carry a level of authority that surprises people. That flip is catnip for viewers, because it makes every interaction unpredictable. Now, I want to address something that often gets brushed past. If a secret identity is truly that huge, then secrecy isn't just personal preference. It's security. It's danger management. And that adds a grim layer to any romance. Because romance usually thrives on openness. But if openness is dangerous, then what does a healthy relationship even look like? How do you build trust when you can't share basic facts? The answer, in good writing, is that trust becomes behavioral rather than informational. You trust someone because of what they do, not what they tell you. You trust them because they protect the child, because they show up, because they don't exploit you, because they give you options when they could force you. That kind of trust is actually more compelling than tell me your secret. It's love built from repeated actions, not one confession. But it requires patience from the show. It requires scenes where characters do small things for each other. And not just romantic small things. Practical small things. Like calming the child down. Like making sure someone eats. Like stepping between someone and public humiliation. Rehook. If you're looking for the real chemistry test, it's not the big romantic moment. It's the first time they disagree about what the child needs. Because that's where you see values. And values are the real foundation of any relationship that has to survive pressure. Now, since we only have the premise, I'm not going to claim specific arcs. But I can tell you the arc shape that would feel satisfying here. The male lead starts with control through invisibility. The CEO starts with control through authority. The child, by simply existing, introduces a type of control neither adult has: emotional reality. Kids don't care about your cover story. Kids care about whether you're safe, whether you're kind, whether you're consistent. So both adults get pulled away from their usual control strategies and forced to adopt something else: genuine responsiveness. That's an arc I'd watch for hours if the show commits. Now, I want to be a little critical about the world ruler piece, not because I hate it, but because it's the most fragile part of the premise. When a drama goes that big, it can accidentally cheapen its own stakes. Because viewers start thinking, okay, if he's the heir to the ruler of the world, why doesn't he just fix everything? It creates a logic problem. The only way to avoid that is to make the power inaccessible in meaningful ways. Maybe he can't use it without exposing himself. Maybe using it would hurt someone. Maybe the ruler structure is political and dangerous. Again, I'm not inventing plot, just pointing out the writing challenge. A strong script would treat his power like a locked room. He has a key, but using it triggers alarms. That makes every choice tense. And it keeps the taxi driver life meaningful, because it's not just cosplay, it's survival strategy. And this is where the CEO can be a brilliant foil, because COS are used to access. They're used to calling someone and making things happen. So watching a CEO collide with a man who could, in theory, make anything happen, but refuses because the cost is too high, could create a really interesting philosophical conflict. She might see him as irresponsible. He might see her as naive. Or worse, he might see her as dangerous because she thinks authority solves everything. That's not just romance conflict. That's worldview conflict. And worldview conflict is the kind that can sustain a long-form drama without feeling repetitive. Rehook. The most compelling villain in this story might not be a person. It might be the idea that your life belongs to your role. Because that's what both leads are fighting in different ways. He's fighting being reduced to heir. She's fighting being reduced to CEO. The child is fighting being reduced to baggage. And the marriage, as an institution, is threatening to reduce all of them to labels on a form. Now, let's get into the emotional mechanics of being dragged. There's a physicality to that word. Dragged, pulled, not asked, not invited. It implies a loss of dignity. So, if the show wants to be emotionally honest, it should allow the male lead to feel humiliated, not just annoyed. Humiliation is a deeper wound than anger. Anger is active. Humiliation is sticky. Humiliation changes how you look at someone afterwards. That means, if romance is going to develop, the CEO should not be allowed to simply win him over with charm. There has to be repair. There has to be some acknowledgement that what she did hurt him. Even if she had reasons. Even if she was scared. Even if she thought it was necessary. Repair is what makes a relationship believable after a power-imbalanced beginning. And because she's a CEO, repair for her might be hard. Powerful people are often not practiced at apology. Or they're practiced at PR apology, not emotional apology. The show has an opportunity to make her growth real. Not just she becomes softer, but she learns how to take emotional accountability without losing her spine. That's growth I'd respect. On the other side, the male-led's growth would ideally not be he stops hiding and becomes king. That's too clean. His growth could be learning the difference between privacy and avoidance. Learning that being seen by a few safe people isn't the same as being exposed to the world. Learning that intimacy isn't theft if it's chosen. But he has to choose it. If the show forces it without his agency, it undermines everything. Agency is the currency here. Everybody's trying to buy agency with whatever they have. Power, urgency, secrecy, paperwork, a child's presence, a public setting. The drama is basically an auction of control. Rehook. Pay attention to who offers choices and who removes them. That's who the story wants you to trust. Now, I want to talk about a detail that's easy to miss but huge. Beautiful CEO. Dramas love calling women beautiful as a shortcut. But beauty is not character. The show will only feel modern and satisfying if it refuses to let beauty be the CEO's main currency. Her real currency, based on her title, should be strategic thinking, competence, and nerve. If the show keeps framing her power as attractiveness, if men do things for her because she's pretty, then it's wasting its own premise. And I'm hoping that's not the case, because the premise already gives her a strong engine. She's decisive enough to drag someone into marriage. That's not a pretty girl move. That's a I'm cornered and I'm choosing violence move. Not literal violence, social violence. Narrative violence. It's a disruption tactic. So I want the show to treat her as a strategist, not a decoration. At the same time, I don't want her to be written as emotionless. I want her emotions to exist, but not in a way that makes her irrational. Emotions are information. Fear is information. Desperation is information. If she's acting urgently, her fear is telling her something. The show should let us feel that fear without making her pathetic. Now, the title's Papaku sang Legenda piece keeps hovering in my mind because it implies that there's a lens of family myth. Whether that's literal fatherhood or symbolic lineage, it suggests that the story might be interested in how legends are built and how they crush the people forced to carry them. Being someone's legend sounds romantic until you realize it means people don't see your flaws. Or worse, they see your flaws as betrayal. So if the male lead is the heir to an all-powerful ruler, he's living under a legend. And the taxi driver cover might be the only place where he's allowed to be imperfect without it becoming a scandal. Which makes the forced marriage even more cruel in a way. It takes his one imperfect, private life and turns it into public narrative. Rehook. What if his biggest fear isn't being exposed as the heir, but being forced to perform legend in a relationship that started as a mistake? That's a delicious psychological angle. Because it means the romance wouldn't just be, will they fall in love? It would be, can he be loved as a normal man? Or will he be loved as a symbol? And for someone hiding as a taxi driver, being loved as a symbol is basically the nightmare. Okay, let's pivot to the audience experience. A premise like this creates two simultaneous viewer cravings. One is the reveal craving. People want the moment where someone realizes who he is. The other is the domestic craving. People want the moments of fake family tenderness, the awkward breakfasts, the accidental bonding, the quiet protecting. The show has to feed both cravings without letting one starve the other. If it leans too hard into reveal teasing, the relationships feel like filler. If it leans too hard into domestic sweetness, that secret identity threatened tension feels fake because the show stops pressuring it. The balance is what makes you binge. Every time you get a warm scene, you should feel the shadow of the secret. Every time you get a suspense scene, you should feel the human stakes. And the child is the bridge between those. Because the child makes domestic scenes feel meaningful and makes suspense scenes feel morally charged. If the secret identity exposure threatens the child's stability, suddenly it's not just about his ego. It's about a kid's safety. Now, I want to bring up the KUA specifically again, not to repeat myself, but because the setting implies cultural texture and social gaze. A public marriage process means people are watching, and people watching is its own antagonist. Even if no one recognizes him as the heir, strangers can still recognize mess. They can judge, they can gossip, they can form narratives. A taxi driver being dragged into marriage with a CEO, people will have opinions. And opinions create pressure. If the show uses that social gaze intelligently, it can generate tension without needing a single villain. Sometimes the villain is just the fact that everyone thinks they're entitled to your story. Rehook. The scariest exposure isn't necessarily the world finding out he's the heir. It's the neighborhood deciding it knows what kind of man he is. Because reputation is a form of prison too. Now, the secret threatened to be revealed also implies that the CEO's move is risky. If she's tying herself to him, she's tying herself to whatever danger comes with his identity, whether she knows it or not. And that sets up a fascinating question of trust. Did she already know? Or is she stepping into a storm blindly? If she knew, she's strategic. If she didn't, she's reckless. Both are interesting, but they create different emotional colors. And I'll be honest, I'd rather watch a strategic woman than a reckless one. Reckless can be annoying if it's not grounded. Strategy is sexy because it implies intelligence and intention. But strategy can also be morally complicated, especially when a child is involved. So again, complexity is the point. Now, let's talk about the male-led's interiority, because secret identity stories sometimes make the mistake of treating the lead like a locked box. Mystery is fine, but if the lead is too opaque, you stop caring. The show should let us feel what it costs him to stay hidden, not through speeches, but through behavior. The way he hesitates before giving a real answer. The way he scans a room automatically. The way his body stiffens when official settings appear. The way he relaxes in the taxi, because it's the one place he has a script. Taxi driving is scripted. Pick up, drop off, polite phrases, familiar routes. Being an heir is not scripted, it's existential. So of course he'd cling to the taxi life. It's the only part of him that feels knowable. And then the CEO tears up the script. Rehook. The taxi meter is a kind of emotional armor. Clear rules, clear costs. Marriage has no meter. That's why he panics. Now, I want to touch on humor again, because the show's title and premise suggest it might flirt with comedic absurdity. If it does, I hope the humor comes from awkward social reality rather than from making serious things silly. Like, there's a world of difference between this is a ridiculous situation and this situation doesn't matter. A good drama uses humor to make the characters feel more human, not to excuse the harm. So if the show has moments like the male lead desperately trying to keep his taxi schedule while being dragged into a life-changing commitment, that can be funny in a relatable way. The absurdity of someone worrying about normal responsibilities while their life implodes is real. People do that. People worry about parking tickets while they're getting divorced. People ask about dinner while they're grieving. That dissonance is human. But the show has to keep the emotional truth intact beneath the comedy. Otherwise, it turns into farce. And farce would make the consent power issues feel flippant. Now, a word on romance pacing. If the show tries to sell you instant love just because there's an instant marriage, it'll feel lazy. The more interesting move is to let affection develop slowly, maybe even reluctantly, in the cracks between conflict. Like, they don't trust each other, but they keep having to coordinate. They keep having to share space. They keep having to make decisions around the child. And in those repeated interactions, they learn each other's tells. They learn what the other person does when they're stressed. They learn what comforts them. That's where love is born in a believable way, familiarity earned under pressure. And crucially, the show can make their bond not just romantic, but protective. Sometimes the first kind of love that forms is "I won't let you be harmed," which is different from "I'm attracted to you." Protective love can come before romantic love, especially when a child is involved. Rehook. If you want to know whether the romance is earned, watch whether they protect each other's dignity in public. Dignity protection is intimacy. Now, let's get into the idea of identity as performance. The male lead is performing ordinary. The CEO is performing composed. And both performances crack under stress. If the show is psychologically sharp, it will show you the cracks as involuntary. Not big breakdowns necessarily. Small breaks. A CEO's voice shaking for half a second. A taxi driver's eyes hardening like someone used to command. Those are the moments that make you lean forward. And it's also where the actors can elevate the material. Because a premise can be wild, but acting can make it feel real. The best drama acting doesn't show emotion. It shows containment. It shows what a character refuses to let out. The refusal is the emotion. The CEO dragging him to marry implies she's refusing to let fear slow her down. The male lead hiding his identity implies he's refusing to let history catch him. These are both containment strategies. Watching those strategies fail is satisfying in a painful way. Now, I want to talk about the potential theme of chosen family, because the premise sets it up without saying it. Marriage plus child plus strangers equals a forced household. And forced households are basically laboratories for chosen family narratives. People who didn't plan to belong together, learning to belong anyway. But chosen family only becomes meaningful if the show respects boundaries. If the male lead is forced into fatherhood without choice, that's not chosen family, that's conscription. The show has to thread that needle. It has to let him choose, even if slowly, to show up for the child. And it has to let the CEO earn his participation, not demand it. And the child, too, deserves agency in the narrative. Not adult agency, but emotional agency. The child should be allowed to dislike him at first, or mistrust him, or cling too quickly, because kids can do that too. Whatever the child feels, the show should treat it as valid, not as a cute beat to be corrected. Rehook. The child's trust, if it comes, should be the hardest thing in the story to earn. Because kids feel hypocrisy. They might not have vocabulary for it, but they feel it. Now, let's examine the premise from the perspective of the male-led's secret being threatened. Threatened by what, exactly? The CEO's public move is one threat. But the bigger threat is that legal ties create paper trails. Once you are married, there are records. Names connect. Addresses connect. Family registries connect. And if you're hiding from a world ruler level apparatus, again, not asserting specifics, just respecting the scale, paper trails are dangerous. So the male-led stress could be less about romance and more about logistics. And that is actually a great way to keep the show grounded. Let him worry about practical things. Let him have that anxious energy of someone thinking 3 steps ahead. Because he has to. Practical anxiety is relatable. It makes even an absurd premise feel tactile. And it also can create interesting conflict with the CEO, who may be used to using systems to solve problems. She might trust institutions more than he does. She might think paperwork makes things official and safe. He might think paperwork makes things traceable and deadly. That difference in how they view the same system is a fantastic source of tension that doesn't require any new characters or plot twists. It's just worldview. Rehook. When two characters look at the same stamped form and feel opposite emotions. Safety versus danger. you've got real drama. Now, a lot of dramas with air premises use wealth as a spectacle. Fancy cars, suits, mansions. But this one starts with a taxi. That's a deliberate aesthetic decision, even if it's just in the premise. It tells you the show might be more interested in the romance of ordinary life than the glamour of wealth. Or at least it wants to start there to create contrast later. And if the show later introduces the world ruler side visually, the contrast could be breathtaking if done well. Imagine going from dusty streets and real sunlight to controlled environments with colder color grading, more symmetrical framing, more silence. That kind of visual shift can make you feel the weight of the hidden world without exposition. It's like the air changes. But again, the show has to avoid turning that into pure porn of wealth. The hidden world should feel dangerous, not just pretty. It should feel like a cage made of luxury. Because otherwise, the audience starts rooting for him to embrace power without considering why he ran. Rehook. If the air world looks too comfortable, the taxi disguise stops making emotional sense. Now, let's talk about the CEO's decision making. Dragging someone to marry immediately suggests either a time-sensitive threat or a high-stakes plan. The presence of a child suggests she's motivated by protection. That's the most generous reading. The least generous reading is that she's using marriage to claim something: status, legitimacy, access. The most realistic reading, in my opinion, is that she's doing a messy combination of both, trying to solve a protective problem using the tool she knows, and the tool she knows is control. That's why I want the show to give her moments where she second-guesses herself. Not in a weak way, but in a human way. The kind of moment where she looks at the child and realizes, if I'm wrong, I've dragged her into something worse. That's the kind of moment that makes a character feel alive. And it would also create a fascinating parallel to the male lead who has probably second-guessed his hiding strategy too. If I stay hidden, am I letting harm happen elsewhere? If I reveal myself, do I create harm? Both characters could be trapped in the same moral logic. Every option has a cost. They just respond differently. Rehook. The drama is at its most compelling when neither character has a clean choice. Because clean choices end stories. Messy choices create episodes. Now, I want to linger on the emotional impact of being forced into a role you didn't consent to, because both leads are being forced into roles. The male lead is being forced into husbandhood publicly. The CEO might be forced into desperation privately. The child is forced into adult conflict. And the world ruler heir label is the ultimate forced role, inheritance as destiny. So the story, at its core, could be about resisting roles or renegotiating them. The male lead might have to decide what kind of husband he can be without giving up himself. The CEO might have to decide what kind of partner she can be without using control as a crutch. And the child might, quietly, be deciding what kind of adults she can trust. That's the emotional skeleton. Everything else is just muscle. Let's talk about dialogue style, because this kind of premise needs dialogue that doesn't over-explain. If the characters say exactly what they feel all the time, the mystery dies. If they say nothing meaningful ever, the audience gets frustrated. The sweet spot is subtext-rich dialogue. Like the CEO saying something that sounds practical but is actually fear. Like the male lead saying something polite that is actually a boundary. Like the child saying something simple that accidentally exposes the adult's lie. Kids are great for that. Kids ask the question adults are avoiding. That's why they're dangerous in plots. Rehook. If the child asks, why are we doing this? And the adults can't answer honestly, that's the whole show in one question. Now, I also want to acknowledge a potential critique. Some viewers will bounce off the premise because it's too extreme. And I get that. Heir to the ruler of the world is not subtle. But subtlety isn't the only path to depth. Sometimes you need a loud premise to crack open quiet feelings. A giant external story to make room for a small internal story. And I'll go further with my contrarian streak here. I actually think the world ruler exaggeration can be a strength if the show uses it as metaphor rather than as logistics. If ruler of the world is a way of saying the weight on his shoulders is unimaginable, then the story becomes about emotional inheritance rather than political mechanics. That's a smarter lane for a romance drama anyway. Because if the show tries to be a detailed geopolitical thriller on top of being a romance with forced marriage and a child, it might collapse under its own ambition. But if it treats the world ruler element like a looming shadow, an abstract pressure that makes every personal choice feel bigger, it can work beautifully. Rehook. The more the show treats power as an emotional burden instead of a toy, the more believable everything becomes. Now, there's another layer here that I don't want to overlook: masculinity. A male-led hiding as a taxi driver suggests humility, but it can also suggest shame. Not shame of the job, shame of the expectations attached to him. Men in these stories often carry the burden of being enough for a role. Enough to inherit, enough to lead, enough to protect, enough to be a legend's son. And when they feel they can't be enough, they disappear. So the male lead disappearing into taxi work could be read as a coping mechanism, a way to be good enough at something manageable. Driving, earning, serving, those are concrete metrics. Heir to the world is not a concrete metric. It's an abyss. And then marriage enters, and marriage is also an abyss. Because you can't measure it like you measure work. You can't clock in and out of being a husband, especially with a child present. So he's being pulled from one manageable identity into another unmanageable one, while the ultimate unmanageable identity, the heir, still looms. That's a lot. That's a character in a vice. Rehook. Watch how the male-led deals with tasks. People reveal their coping style through chores, errands, routines. It sounds mundane, but it's truth. Now, about the CEO's femininity, because beautiful CEO characters often get boxed into two options: icy and perfect, or secretly fragile and waiting to be saved. I want a third option. A woman whose competence is real, whose fear is real, and whose tenderness is chosen, not extracted. If the show lets her be controlling without demonizing her, and vulnerable without infantilizing her, then she becomes one of those female leads you actually remember. Because the thing about CEOs is they're often written as fantasies of control. But a fantasy of control is usually a response to chaos. So if a life is chaotic right now, hence the urgent marriage, her CEO persona might be her armor. The show can do something powerful by letting that armor be both admirable and suffocating. Let her be brave and wrong at the same time. Let her make a plan that has costs. Let her do the hard thing and then have to face the emotional fallout. Rehook. If the CEO is always right, she's not a character. She's a trophy. Don't do that to her. Now, I want to talk about chemistry in a slightly different way. People think chemistry is about flirting. It's not. Chemistry is about attention. Who watches who? Who notices small changes? Who anticipates needs? Who gets under whose skin? In a forced marriage premise, chemistry can look like irritation that becomes respect. It can look like someone trying to keep their distance and failing because they care about the child. It can look like silence that feels charged because there's too much to say. So if you're watching Sultan Nyamar and you're like, why am I suddenly invested? It won't be because they had a cute moment. It'll be because, at some point, one of them pays attention in a way the other person isn't used to. The taxi driver might listen to her without judging. The CEO might see his exhaustion and not demand more. The child might reach for his hand without meaning to. Those moments rewire the dynamic. Rehook. The first moment of real intimacy is often when someone stops trying to win. Now, from a storytelling structure perspective, the premise sets up multiple clocks. There's the clock of the secret being exposed. There's the clock of the CEO's urgency, whatever is driving it. There's the clock of the child's stability. Kids need routine, they need safety, and instability compounds. The more clocks you have, the more tension you can sustain. But too many clocks can make a story feel frantic if they're not harmonized. A good long-form drama chooses one primary clock and uses the others to complicate it. My guess, from the premise, is that the secret exposure is the primary clock. Everything else either accelerates it or creates moral reasons to delay it. And if the show is really smart, it'll use the marriage itself as a clock. Because marriage isn't just a status change, it creates expectations. People will ask questions. Families might be involved. Social circles collide. Even if no one knows he's the heir, they'll still want to know who he is, where he's from, what his plans are. And the more people ask, the more he has to lie, and the more likely he is to slip. That's how you build tension without adding random villains. You let normal social behavior become pressure. Rehook. Sometimes the scariest question isn't, "Who are you?" It's, "So what do you do for a living?" Because that question forces him to either commit to the lie or risk truth. And committing to a lie in front of a child feels worse. Now, I want to talk about the moral complexity of the CEO bringing the child into this. If she's desperate, she might genuinely believe she's doing the safest thing. But safety is not just physical, it's emotional. Dragging a child into sudden marriage chaos can be emotionally destabilizing even if the adults think they're protecting her. The show has an opportunity to depict that with sensitivity. The child's confusion, clinginess, acting out, shutting down, those are realistic responses. If the show ignores the child's emotional experience and just uses her as a cute bridge to romance, it will feel hollow. But if it respects her reactions as part of the consequence of adult decisions, it becomes richer. I'm saying this because a lot of dramas want that single-parent romance vibe without doing the hard part, which is showing how complicated it is for a child to adjust. And the premise here is even more abrupt than usual, which means the child's adjustment should be even more intense. Rehook. The child doesn't need to cry every scene to show she's affected. Sometimes the most heartbreaking sign is when a kid gets unusually quiet. Now, let's go back to that secret identity-threatened piece and talk about Paranoia. Paranoia is a storytelling gift if used carefully. It can make mundane scenes feel suspenseful. A passerby glancing too long, a phone ringing at the wrong time, a stranger asking an innocent question. Paranoia turns the world into a minefield. But paranoia can also become repetitive if the show plays the same note too often. The key is to make paranoia evolve. At first, he's scared of being recognized. Later, he might be scared of what the CEO will do if she finds out. Or he might be scared of what he will do if he's forced to choose between protecting his secret and protecting the child. Those are different fears. And different fears require different acting, different writing. So if the show is good, you'll feel the fear shift over time. It becomes less about "they'll catch me" and more about "I'm becoming attached." And that makes me vulnerable. That's the real tension. Attachment as risk. Rehook. The moment he starts wanting a normal life is the moment the story becomes truly cruel. Because now there's something to lose. Now, I want to say something about titles and legacies again, because sang Legenda implies a mythic parental figure, and the premises ruler of the world implies a towering authority. Even if the show never foregrounds the father figure directly, again, not asserting, there's an emotional inheritance here. Being raised under a legend can warp your relationship with yourself. People raised under legends often become either perfectionists or escape artists. The male lead feels like an escape artist. The taxi is his getaway car, ironically slow and stuck in traffic, but still a getaway. The CEO dragging him into marriage is like someone blocking the alleyway. And that makes me think the drama might, at its best, be about whether love can be a new form of identity. Not a role imposed by birth, but a role chosen through care. That's the hopeful interpretation. But hope only lands if the show is willing to sit in discomfort first. Rehook. If you're not uncomfortable early on, the later tenderness won't feel earned. Now, I'm going to pivot into a craft conversation about visual tone again, because this is a 2026 release and audiences are more visually literate than ever. People notice when lighting tells the truth. If the taxi scenes are shot with naturalistic light, harsh sun, neon at night, reflections, while the corporate scenes are shot with clean, controlled palettes, the show can visually encode the identity split. The problem is when dramas make everything look equally glossy. Gloss kills grit, and this premise needs grit, at least in the taxi layer, or you lose the emotional grounding. Editing can also communicate panic. A sudden jump cut, a slight audio drop, a focus pull that lags behind a character's movement. These are subtle ways to make you feel disoriented without screaming at you. If the KUS sequence is edited with too much polish, it might feel like a romantic montage instead of a crisis. I want it to feel like a crisis, even if it's funny, especially if it's funny, because laughter in crisis is a real thing. People laugh when they're overwhelmed. That's human. Rehook. If the show can make you laugh and then immediately feel guilty for laughing, that's powerful tonal control. Now, let's talk about the audience's relationship to the male lead. Secret identity male leads can sometimes become insufferable because the show treats their secrecy as automatically noble. He's hiding to protect everyone. Okay, but who asked? Who consented to being protected by being lied to? That's where a lot of shows slip into paternalism. So I want Sultan Nyamar to avoid that trap. I wanted to make the male lead's secrecy understandable but not sacred. I wanted to show the collateral damage of secrecy. Not in a preachy way, in a relationship way. Because secrecy doesn't just protect. It also isolates. It also creates distance. It also creates misunderstandings that harm people. And the CEO's forced marriage move is kind of the mirror image of that. She's forcing transparency through institution. She's saying, you can't hide, because now we're legally connected. That's also harmful in a different way. So you have to characters using control strategies that hurt. That's great drama, if handled honestly. Rehook. The story isn't good person meets bad person. It's two people with flawed coping mechanisms collide. Now, I want to get granular about relationship microdynamics because that's where the show will hook you episode after episode. There's the question of who speaks for whom in public. If the CEO is used to speaking for others, she might answer questions about him. That could irritate him. If he's used to being invisible, he might let her, then resent it later. That's a real dynamic couples have when one partner is more socially dominant. There's also the question of physical space. Who sits where? Who stands closer to the child? Who naturally positions themselves between the child and strangers? Those blocking choices communicate trust and protectiveness without words. A good director uses blocking like dialogue. And then there's the question of money, which is always present when you have a CEO and a taxi driver. Money isn't just income. It's power. It's options. If the CEO offers solutions that require money, the male-led might feel bought. If the male-led refuses those solutions, the CEO might feel like he's being stubborn. But underneath, it's about dignity again. About not wanting to be controlled by resources. If the show leans into those subtle class tensions without turning them into caricature, it becomes richer. Rehook. Romance across class lines is never just romance. It's negotiation. Now, the sole heir to the ruler of the world flips the class tension in a way that's almost cruelly ironic. Because the male lead is not actually lower class in origin, but he is living lower class in practice. That creates a particular kind of tension. Is his taxi life authentic or performative? Is it a sincere choice or a costume? And I can already hear viewers arguing about that, which is honestly a sign of a good premise. Because it forces you to confront what authentic even means. If he genuinely works hard, lives simply, and experiences ordinary life, does it matter that he could leave at any time? Some people will say yes, it matters. Others will say lived experience is lived experience. The show can make that debate emotionally relevant if it lets the CEO react to his truth in a complicated way. Maybe she feels betrayed. Maybe she feels relieved. Maybe she feels used. Maybe she feels safe. Maybe she feels angry that he chose to live like this while she's been fighting corporate battles. Again, not claiming specifics, just outlining the emotional landscape the premise makes possible. Rehook, the reveal, when it comes, isn't just about shock. It's about what the truth recontextualizes. Now, I want to talk about how the show might handle the ruler of the world without turning it into pure fantasy. There's a way to do it through symbolism. The heir identity could show up in moments of instinct. Like the male head has a different relationship to fear, or a different threshold for disrespect, or a different capacity for calm. Not because he's better, but because he's been trained. If the show portrays that training as both a strength and a trauma, it becomes interesting. Because training often means emotional suppression. It means being taught to hide feelings, to strategize, to never show weakness. That kind of upbringing would make intimacy hard. It would make marriage terrifying. It would make being around a child who is pure emotion both healing and destabilizing. That's a rich psychological stew, and it doesn't require any additional plot events. It just requires the show to understand its own premise. Rehook. The child might be the first person in his life who doesn't care about his status, and that can feel like oxygen. Now, let's talk about the CEO's urgency again. Because the premise says she suddenly appears and drags him to marry immediately. That implies she had no time for negotiation, no time for romance. That means her problem is immediate. When a character behaves like that, the audience naturally starts asking, what's chasing her? Even if we never get a detailed answer early on, that sense of pursuit creates tension. And pursuit can be literal or social. It can be a person. It can be scandal. It can be corporate pressure. It can be family pressure. It can be a deadline. Whatever it is, the show can use the CEO's behavior to communicate threat without exposition. How she looks over her shoulder. How she checks her phone. How she flinches at a name. Again, small choices. And if the show gives the male lead enough emotional intelligence to notice those choices, then their relationship can start not from attraction, but from observation. He sees her fear. She sees his restraint. That's the beginning of mutual recognition. Rehook. The first bond might be, you're scared too, not, I like you. Now, I want to address the title's Sultan Nyamar phrase. Because even without translating it on screen, it evokes disguise, pretending, masquerade energy. The whole show is about performance. And performance is exhausting. So one of the most satisfying moments in a story like this is when a character stops performing in front of someone else for the first time. That's why I keep emphasizing quiet scenes. Because quiet scenes are where performance drops. Not because the character chooses to be honest, but because they're too tired to keep the mask tight. Those moments can be tiny. A sigh, a slumped shoulder, a softer voice. But they hit. And for viewers, those are the oh, I care moments. Rehook. If you find yourself leaning toward the screen during a silence, the show has you. Now, let's talk about potential pitfalls, because loving a premise doesn't mean ignoring its risks. Forced marriage stories can accidentally normalize coercion. Secret identity stories can accidentally normalize emotional manipulation. Child enrollment stories can accidentally instrumentalize kids. CEO versus ordinary stories can accidentally romanticize inequality. That's a lot of landmines. But here's the hopeful thing. The premise also gives the writers tools to avoid those landmines. The child can be used to force accountability. The secrecy threat can be used to show the cost of lies. The CEO's power can be used to examine control rather than glamorize it. The heir premise can be used to explore burden rather than fantasy. It's all about intention. And intention shows up in consequences. If harmful choices lead to real fallout, and the characters have to face that fallout, the show is not endorsing the harm. If harmful choices get rewarded without reflection, then we have a problem. Rehook. Ask yourself, does the story make room for regret? Regret is where morality lives in drama. Now, another craft element, set design. Even with limited premise information, we know we have at least three worlds: taxi streets, corporate CEO, and institutional KUA. A smart production design will differentiate these worlds not just by location, but by texture. The taxi world should feel worn in. The CEO world should feel curated. The institutional world should feel utilitarian. And the collision scenes, where worlds mix, should feel slightly wrong, slightly tense. Like a CEO in a cramped taxi with her heels catching on the floor mat. Like a taxi driver in an office lobby feeling the air conditioning hit too cold. Like a child in a bureaucratic waiting room swinging her legs because she's bored while adults are panicking. Those visual moments tell the story without dialogue. Rehook. The most telling props in dramas are the ones nobody mentions. Now, if I zoom out even more, I think the drama is playing with a fantasy that a lot of people have but don't admit. The fantasy that someone powerful will choose you specifically not because you're powerful too, but because you're you. The CEO choosing the taxi driver is that fantasy, even if it starts as strategy. The audience wants to believe he has something she needs that money can't buy. Calm, honesty, a kind of groundedness, or simply anonymity. And the flip fantasy is that someone ordinary is secretly extraordinary. That's the male-led's fantasy. The show is basically stacking two audience fantasies on top of each other, and then adding a child to make it feel morally serious. That's clever. It's manipulative, but clever. The challenge is to turn fantasy into character truth. To make the taxi driver actually grounded, not just poor, but noble. To make the CEO actually competent, not just rich, but lonely. To make the child actually affected, not just cute, but wise. If the show can do that, it becomes more than fantasy. Rehook. The most memorable dramas are the ones that admit the fantasy and still tell the truth. Now, I want to get a little more emotional again, because this premise touches something tender, the idea of being claimed. When the CEO drags him into marriage, it's a twisted form of claiming. It's aggressive, but the need underneath it, if there is need, might be the need to not be alone. The need to anchor. The need to create family when the world is unstable. And I'm not excusing the method. I'm just saying, people do irrational things when they're desperate for stability, especially when a child's stability is on the line. That's why I can feel empathy and discomfort at the same time. It's messy. It's human. It's not a PSA. It's drama. And the male-led's secrecy is also a twisted form of not being alone. Because isolation is lonely, but it's also safe. It's the kind of safe that doesn't require trust. So when someone forces connection, it can feel like an attack even if it becomes healing later. That's why the beginning has to be rough. Healing stories often start with harm. The question is whether the story knows the difference between depicting harm and romanticizing it. Rehook. If the show makes you argue with yourself while watching, it's doing something right. Now, one more angle that I think could make Sultan Nyamar stand out. The taxi driver's relationship to the city. Taxi drivers know the city in a way COS don't. They know shortcuts, neighborhoods, moods. They know where the city is kind and where it's cruel. If the show uses the city as a character, again, through atmosphere, sound, and routine, it can make the male-led's ordinary life feel rich and lived in. And then the CEO entering that city life could be portrayed as her stepping into a world she doesn't control. That's important. Because COS control environments. They curate spaces. A city doesn't care about your title. Traffic doesn't care. Rain doesn't care. Crowds don't care. If the show uses those uncontrollable elements to humble her, not punish her, just humble her, it can create real growth. And it can also create moments of bonding. Being stuck in traffic together. Sharing an umbrella. getting drenched, laughing because everything is ridiculous. Those aren't plot-heavy moments, but they're relationship-building moments. Rehook, shared inconvenience is underrated romance fuel. Now, I want to talk about the legend concept one last time in this stretch because it's looming. Legends are about storytelling. They're about the version of someone that gets passed around. The male lead has been controlling his story by erasing it. The CEO is trying to control her story by forcing a new chapter. The child is too young to control her story at all, which makes the adult's choices even more important. So the drama might, at its best, be about narrative ownership. Who gets to tell your story? Who gets to define you? Is it your father's legacy? Your job title? Your marital status? Your bank account? Or is it what you do when you're cornered? That's a theme I can get behind, because it's real. People get trapped in stories other people wrote for them all the time. And that's where I leave this for now, sitting in that tension of narrative ownership. Because it's the kind of tension that can keep unfolding in scene after scene without needing the show to throw in random explosions. It can just keep tightening the net of expectations around these characters and see what breaks first.